Welcome to IWP. My name is Mac Owens. I'm the Dean of Academics here. Before I introduce our speaker, I have to give our little commercial about IWP. For those of you who don't know anything about it, we are a independent graduate school of national security affairs, statesmanship in national security affairs. We offer 3 master's degrees, full master's degrees, an executive and a professional MA, and also 18 certificates. So, if you know anybody who wants to come to graduate school, let us know. Taking applications. Now, one of the really cool things about being the dean here is I get to invite my friends to come talk. And Nick is one of my friends, former colleague. Well, actually, we are colleagues. I'll explain that in a minute. But we taught together at the Naval War College for a number of years. Nick Gvosdev is Professor of National Security Affairs. He is also the holder of the Jerome E. Levy Chair of Economic Geography and National Security at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. As I say, I taught there for 28 years. We overlap. But he is also a senior fellow for the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program and program on national security. I'm the editor of Orbis, so I'm at FPRI, so we continue to be colleagues. Nick was formerly the editor of National Interest, and he senior fellow at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. His degree is one of those, Oxford degrees, St. Antony's College, Oxford, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. He has spoken widely on Russian and Eurasian affairs. His work has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, and Orbis. Yes, there you go. And he's appeared frequently as a commentator on numerous television programs and so forth. He is the co-author of U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Strategy, The Rise of the Incidental Superpower. Now, I'm a co-author of that too, but that's a little misleading. He and another colleague of ours wrote most of the book. I wrote 2 chapters, okay? But somehow they gave me co-author, status in it. So I'll take it. But anyway, Nick is one of these guys who's forgotten more about Russian policy than most people will ever know. So please join me in welcoming Nick Gvosdev to Foreign Policy Research Institute. Do-si-do.
Well, thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. Mac is, of course, familiar with this part of the drill, being associated with the Naval War College, this is where I give my disclaimer to say, although what I'm going to give you now are my personal thoughts and impressions, and I'm not speaking in any official capacity for the college, the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So I was asked to talk a bit about where U.S.-Russia relations are going in the first. We're coming up on the 100th day anniversary of the new administration. Secretary of State Tillerson is in Moscow today for talks with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now apparently not scheduled to have a meeting with President Putin to try to give a sense of where U.S.-Russia relations might be headed, and is the Trump administration doing anything different or significant. And what's interesting is that in the first several months is that the Trump administration is following the same path that its 3 predecessor administrations have with regard to U.S.-Russia relations. We're seeing some of the same tendencies, same muscle memory of U.S.-Russia relations still impacting what the new administration is doing. And what I thought I would do then is just to start with 3 broad overviews and set the stage, and then open it up for questions and comments and start the really interesting part, which is the discussion and the back and forth. And the first is, what exactly does Russia want? And for the last 20 years or so, Russia has had a relatively, or more specifically, the Russian political and economic establishment has had a relatively consistent view of what it wants in the world, ever since the second term of the Yeltsin administration, carrying over into the 2 terms of the Putin administration, the 1 term of the Medvedev administration, and now the 3rd term of Putin in the Kremlin. And what the Kremlin wants can be summarized in these broad strokes. First is that Russia should have a free hand in how it governs itself, that the choices of the Russian political and economic elite as to how Russia is to be governed, how Russian society is to be structured, those are decisions for Russia alone, not open to veto by any international body, not open to criticism, certainly by the United States or the European Union, that Russia should run its own affairs with no interference from external actors. This is sometimes summed up in the phrase sovereign democracy, which was coined by Vladislav Surkov, who was one of Putin's assistants in the presidential administration. It fits into the Russian notion of a great power. A great power, by definition, is one that does not have agendas imposed on it by other powers. You are a great power if you are able to exist independently in the international order without having to accept the dictates of other powers or groups of powers. So that's the starting point, the free hand in internal affairs. The second is the idea that Russia should have a zone of privileged interests in its larger Eurasian neighborhood. That Russia should have its economic interests respected, that no country that borders Russia or controls vital lines of communication for Russia to reach the outside world should be a part of a security or political alliance which either Russia is not a member of or which Russia does not have influence in. This has been a relatively consistent position, again, since the Yeltsin administration, second term, after an initial period where Russia in the early 90s seemed to signal it was not opposed to NATO expansion into the former Soviet bloc, and then that position hardened and has been consistent ever since. And finally, the third demand or ask that Russia has had is that Russia, as one of the world's great powers, has a seat at the table of the great powers in determining what happens in world affairs. And it is not simply enough for Russia to have a voice in world affairs, but that Russia should have the ability to affect whatever final settlements there are, and that in the case of Russia having interests or having clients, that it can deliver for them. And again, this is an outgrowth of what happened during the Yugoslav wars of succession in the 1990s, where the Russian perception was that when what's going to happen in former Yugoslavia, the U.S. was willing to hear what Russia wanted and then would do whatever it wanted anyway. And the Russians took from that what they want out of the international system is one where they can make demands on behalf of their clients, the people that they're patrons of, or they can get end states that fit what they want, and they're willing to compromise on that, but that they have a right to be at the table and to bargain. And it's not for nothing that, particularly if you look at the curriculum of the Russian foreign policy establishment, if you look at the Foreign Institute at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, the ideal period that they look to is the Congress of Vienna, the Congress system of 19th century Europe, which is an international order where the great powers sit down and they bargain among themselves for the outcomes that occur. Medium powers get to make their asks. Small powers get to petition, but then have to live with whatever the great powers have decided. So it's not surprising that Russian diplomacy of the 21st century looks to European diplomacy of the 19th century as a golden age of diplomacy and the preferred model for how the world ought to work. So when U.S. statesmen who think that it's an insult would say things like, well, Russia doesn't operate as if they're in the 21st century, they're operating as if they're in the 19th century, Russians took that as a compliment, of course. Well, great, you're telling us we're operating in the period that we actually think was the most effective for diplomacy. So this has been the basic contours of the Russian ask for the last 20 years. Now, tactically, the Russians have moved from strategy to strategy. So when Putin first took over in 2000, his initial impression was that Russia could gain most of this through a partnership with Europe, especially a partnership with Germany. So the initial Russian activity in 2000 was to reach out to the Germans, to the British, and others, and to argue for a settlement along these lines. After 9/11, the sense was that Russia would be a partner of the United States in the war on terror, and then the United States would be more inclined to grant or see things Russia's way. Since then, Russia has flirted with its partnership with China, seeing the BRICS perhaps as a model of a partnership with Brazil and India and South Africa and other rising non-Western powers as a way to offset the power and influence of the United States and Europe. So tactically, they've moved from different strategies, but the overall broad strokes of the objectives have remained reasonably consistent for the past 20-some years. So if this is what Russia is asking for, what should the U.S. response be? And again, there's been a relative consistency in approaches towards Russia that cross party lines, that cross administrations. And I will be simplifying them a bit here for purposes of convenience, but we can really divide them into two broad camps: Russia engagers and Russia skeptics. So Russia engagers start from the premise that the Russian ask, sovereign democracy at home, some degree of influence in the Eurasian space, a seat at the table of global affairs, that can be a start for negotiation. Doesn't mean that the United States caves in and just gives Russia whatever it wants and simply says whatever Moscow wants, Moscow gets, but that you can start a process of negotiation from that basis. And you start a process of negotiation from that basis because you have assessed that Russia can assist or provide help in things that matter more to the United States. So the idea is that you're negotiating, you're engaging with Russia because you see that the U.S. has bigger fish to fry in the Middle East, in Asia, in dealing with global problems, and you think that a Russia inside the tent can be helpful and a Russia outside the tent can be unhelpful. And so you engage with Russia in the hopes of finding some compromises that will put Russia more in line with what the U.S. wants to see happen in the world. Russia skeptics start from the perspective that the demand that Russia has made in and of itself is inimical to American interests, that American interests are not served by acknowledging sovereign democracy at home in Russia, of giving Russia any sort of sphere of influence in its what the Russians like to call their near abroad, and that Russian participation in global fora often tends to be a place where Russia obstructs rather than Russia being constructive. And so the starting point for a Russia skeptic is, how do you get Russia, you don't bargain with Russia on these demands that Russia has, how do you get Russia to change its demands? Either because Russia will come to a conclusion that it can't achieve them, and therefore it gives up on them, or you expect that Russia cannot sustain its position in the world over the long run, and therefore won't be able to maintain its position. That the Russian economy, Russian demographics, political tensions inside of Russia will cause Russia's ability to project power to weaken and to atrophy. And Russia skeptics tend to be thinking that when people say, well, Russia can contribute in solving North Korea, helping with Iran, dealing with ISIS, to say that either the help that Russia can provide is not particularly useful to the U.S., or the price that Russia is asking for its help is not worth it. So these are the two broad camps that we have seen in Russia policy. They existed during the Clinton administration, they were certainly present during the Bush and Obama administrations, and now we see signs of them both being present in the Trump administration. Now the problem for formulating policy is not that one of these camps is necessarily right or wrong. It depends, of course, what objectives you want, how you assess the situation. One could look and say, was Russia instrumental in getting the Iran deal? If you think the Iran deal was something good, then Russia's help was invaluable, and yes, that validates the engagement perspective. If you think that the Iran deal in the end wasn't that beneficial to U.S. and global security, then the fact that the Russians helped with it is not a net positive. So one can look at the same set of factors and, based upon being a Russia engager or a Russia skeptic, come to different conclusions. The problem when it comes to policy is it's a lot like watching Roman gladiatorial games. So the Romans like to pit different types of fighters against each other in the arena. Right? So you have the Libyan, the Nubian, the Gaul, the German, the Thracian, and of course they were always armed with different weapons and different defenses. So you have, the man with the net and the trident against the man with the sword and the half shield, and you pit them together. And Russia policy has, unfortunately, often followed the same pattern, which is that Russia engagers can make a case, and then they have two major problems that face them. The first is that Russia often does things that makes the engager's case in the halls of U.S. government all that much more difficult. So you go ahead and you say, this is why we need to work with Russia, and then an opposition politician mysteriously gets shot, little green men show up somewhere, ordnance gets dropped in a civil war somewhere, and every argument that you're making in favor of engagement now has to deal with what is perceived as Kremlin bad behavior and makes it all that much more difficult. So Russia doesn't always cooperate with helping the case for Russia engagement by what it does. The second problem for the Russia engagers in a U.S. administration is that if you accept that there are compromises that have to be made with Russia, it invariably means the U.S. is going to have to say no to people. It's going to have to say no when someone comes and says, we'd like the U.S. to do more to stand up for freedom in Russia. Neighbors of Russia that say, we really want to belong to the full panoply of Euro-Atlantic institutions. You're going to have to say no, and those no's carry with it political capital, price in political capital, and often U.S. politicians don't want to pay that price. So the engagement camp runs up against that. So we saw it with the initial rapprochement between Presidents Putin and Bush, the initial stages of the reset between Presidents Obama and Medvedev. The low-hanging fruit was doable. When you got to the more difficult issues, resets stalled, because then you were talking about having to start saying no to competing interests, and the engagers were never able to get over that hump. On the other hand, the Russia skeptics run into a problem in advocating for stronger policies against Russia, because Russia is not the Soviet Union. Soviet Union posed an existential threat to the United States. You could say Russia still poses one in theory because of its position as a nuclear power, but Russia does not pose the same threat that the Soviet Union did. Therefore, it's harder to mobilize people to accept sacrifices vis-a-vis Russia, to say you must now accept higher risks or higher costs because of things that Russia is doing that are a more limited nature and don't necessarily pose an immediate threat to the U.S. homeland or to the U.S. economy. So we have the first Orange Revolution in 2004, brings a pro-Western government to power in Ukraine. Members of Congress were very happy to turn out in orange ties when President Yushchenko came to address a joint session of Congress. When President Yushchenko asked for things like, can we get preferential trade treatment so that Ukrainian steel can be sold in U.S. markets, then all of a sudden members of Congress said, but I'm wearing an orange tie. Isn't that enough to show you support? We're not going to go up against the U.S. domestic steel industry. Or when people said, well, why don't we increase the number of visas? Europe is finally doing this for Ukraine now, after so many years of finally Ukraine will get visa-free travel. But for many years, the Europeans resisted this as well, because, well, we don't want Ukrainians to potentially migrate to Europe or to the United States. So, again, I'm wearing an orange tie. Isn't that enough to show support? Or I'm willing to give you some small amounts of aid, but nothing that would be too costly. So we have that problem, that you can lay out a case for why being skeptical of Russia, for Russia containment, makes strategic sense, then you have to sell it politically. So if we look at, for example, the sanctions that we imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and then after the incidents in eastern Ukraine, and you talk to people who were involved in that, and they'll tell you privately that we imposed sanctions first to send a signal, but we imposed sanctions up to the point at which they would, we hoped that they would have damage to the Russian economy, but not to the point that they would cause real damage or cost to the United States. So we were willing to impose sanctions on Russia, but not to really do anything that would cause irreparable economic damage for American companies. We impose some things on state oil companies not being able to get financing, on certain degrees of technology transfer. We don't kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. We have plenty of people who said we've got to take the fight to the Russians, but don't affect the ability of Russians to come buy property in New York and Florida, because particularly in South Florida, Russian money is part of the, along with some other Brazilians, Venezuelans, and others, is a big thing of why the South Florida property market is doing well. So punish the Russians, but not at the cost of really causing too much pain for the United States. And so what this means is that this tension between engagers and skeptics is you end up with Russia policies that often are unsatisfying compromises. So the skeptics can put roadblocks in favor of closer engagement. The engagers at the same time can raise doubts about whether or not things skeptics want to do will fly politically, because they run the risk of raising costs, economic costs, risks of war. We certainly saw some of these themes in the 2016 campaign. The idea of, particularly among some of the groups that were vocally in favor of President Trump, he's not going to get us involved in a war with Russia in a way that Secretary Clinton might, because America first, and America first being the guiding principle of his foreign policy means we won't necessarily see every dispute between Russia and one of her neighbors as involvement for the United States. So we can see these two tendencies at work there. Given the way that the Trump administration has begun to staff, or in many cases not to staff, the administration, we don't yet have a clear sense of where the breaks will be between Russia engagers and Russia skeptics, and certainly something from the Russian side that has been very confusing over the last 2 weeks is looking at a wide panoply of statements coming out of the administration and trying to figure out which of them actually reflects what the president wants. The president has actually said very little. Secretary Tillerson, UN Ambassador Haley, Secretary Mattis, leaks about supposedly what General McMaster is thinking of at the NSC, all of which have a sense of everything from new sanctions being imposed on Russia to we really want a constructive relationship with Russia to fight terrorism and other things. And I'm sure one of the first things Secretary Tillerson is being asked in Moscow today is, all right, so which of these is the real position of the administration, and which of these should we believe, and which of these are more statements for domestic political consumption or to placate people in Congress. The final problem that we have, and the Trump administration as of yet is not seemingly going to do something different than its predecessors, is the way in which Russia policy is formulated within the government, so a structural issue. Again, in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union was the central organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. Every regional crisis in Africa, problems in Latin America, questions about oil supply, everything had a Soviet prism that we would look through. How would this affect the balance with the Soviet Union? Russia, as I said, is not the Soviet Union. It's not necessarily the biggest problem that the U.S. faces in the world. It may not even be on the top 5 of problems that the U.S. needs to deal with. It may not, in fact, be one of the most critical relations. China, perhaps more important, the transatlantic relationship. But what we've gone is we've gone from a system where we had an approach towards Soviet policy that took as its starting point the Soviet Union. And we now have a policy process that looks at a wide variety of geographic and functional issues in which Russia may play a role, but which Russia is not the important or deciding point. So you have a missile defense working group, and it works through the process, and it finally ends up with a policy on missile defense. And then at the 11th hour, you say, okay, well, so now how do the Russians fit into this? Or how do they fit into NATO policy? Or how do they fit into the Middle East? Or how do they fit into energy policy? We don't have as a starting point looking at Russia as Russia and saying, how does Russia influence a variety of items on the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and starting with Russia as the starting point, not with Russia as the 11th hour. I guess we have to figure out what Moscow thinks on this issue, and we've already spent so much time in the interagency process trying to wrestle this problem to the ground. We really don't want to have to go back and revisit when someone comes in and says, you know what, the Russians may have a problem with this. we have a structure that kind of wants to minimize that. We've also, so far in the Trump administration, the decision was made to take Russia and to put it back in the National Security Council process back with Europe, to recreate a Europe and Russia directorate. And I understand the motivation behind that. That's to try to cut down on the growth, perhaps one would say uncontrolled growth, of the White House staff over the last 3 administrations. You know, this doubling every administration, 50 NSC staff that Bush bequeaths to Clinton, which becomes 100, that Clinton bequeaths to Bush, which becomes 200, which Bush bequeaths to Obama, and which ends up at around 400 that is bequeathed to President Trump. So I understand on the one hand you want to cut down on the perception of everything being micromanaged out of the White House. The problem is that Russia is not just simply a European power. And if you have put Russia back in the Russia and Europe box, then increasingly you are likely to view Russia through only a European lens. So when King Abdullah comes this past week, as he did, and says, we really need to think about Russia as a Middle Eastern power and the balance of what are incentives to get Russia to be more constructive on Syria, and then it runs up against, well, but Russia's in the Europe box, and the Europe box isn't talking to the Middle East box, and we don't think of Russia as a Middle Eastern power, so therefore that constrains our creative, how we can be creative. Another thing that's on the horizon is Russia's also Pacific power. And it was quite telling that when Secretary Clinton talked about the pivot, the United States is going to pivot to the Asia Pacific. And in that grand foreign affairs article, Russia's never mentioned, because we think of Russia as a European power. We have drawn this box that says Russia is Europe, Europe and Russia, and therefore it doesn't exist in any other part of the world. Our allies in Japan are very interested in Russia as a Pacific power because they look at the emerging balances that are taking place in the Far East and would very much like a Russia that is not too dependent on China, and a Russia that has more independent lines of communication, particularly with Japan. And for Japan to consider playing a much greater role in developing the Russian Far East, developing energy resources, developing the transport and infrastructure resources, making sure that Russia has a firm grip on those territories so that Russia is not overly dependent on China, and at the same time Russia can then balance China and help enhance Japan's own security. We have benefited from a relatively ham-handed Russian approach towards Japan in that the Russians have not been as creative as they could be in giving Prime Minister Abe more of the diplomatic victory he needs on the islands. And again, sometimes the Russian right hand and left hand, you have a Russian-Japanese meeting, and then Prime Minister Medvedev has to show up in the Kuriles and declare that this is Russian territory forever, and we're going to be increasing our military presence, which creates difficulties. But the Japanese may come to a point where they will say they joined us as a member of the G7 in imposing sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. At some point, it may come that Japan will say, we understand why there needs to be pressure on Russia and Ukraine, but we now have a countervailing interest in starting to develop the Russian Far East. And we may need to bend or break those sanctions. And if we don't have a way of thinking about Russia as a Pacific power, if we're always thinking of Russia structurally in the U.S. government as simply an extension of a greater Europe, then I don't know that how we would be able to respond to that effectively. And either we may have Japan say, well, we're going to have to move ahead with ditching the G7 consensus on sanctions, assuming that there's been no meaningful progress on a settlement in Ukraine, or we will ourselves need to be more creative in how we help Japan with its efforts to ensure that Russia can act as a balancer in the Far East to China. But again, if you have Russia in the Europe box alone, you can't think creatively about Russia as a Pacific power. We have been behind the 8 ball for the last number of years in thinking of Russia as a Middle Eastern power. Russia's relationship with Turkey, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt, and now with Russia back in Libya, perhaps. And so I think the Trump administration may need to revisit that and be thinking about Russia as a standalone issue and how it formulates foreign policy, because I think putting Russia back in the Europe box and then having Russia just simply be the 11th hour addition to a whole host of other problems is not going to serve us well. We'll know tomorrow whether or not Secretary Tillerson ends up with a surprise meeting with President Putin. Tillerson is perhaps touring the Kremlin and just happens to run into the Russian president, and for them to have a chat and to see whether or not that starts a dialogue. The Russians were interested. They wanted to know. They've wanted to know who is going to handle the Russia portfolio. Is it going to be Secretary Tillerson? Is he the one who will carry the messages back? Is he going to have enough time and focus? If not him, is it going to be someone else? We don't have an announced Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Russia, so there's we can either deal with the holdovers from the Obama administration, which the president may or may not be willing to do. Is this going to be a priority of his national security advisor? Are we going to have a dialogue? And ultimately, the president will have to decide, or maybe not, whether or not he's going to fall more on the engager or the skeptic side of things, and what he wants of Russia and what he expects Russia to deliver. Right now, those are still all very open questions. We may have a bit more clarity after tomorrow. We may not really have resolution until we have the first face-to-face between the two presidents, either on the sidelines of the G20 or has been floated maybe on the sidelines of an Arctic summit later this summer. So we are in a bit of a holding pattern now, so we'll have to see what happens. So with that, let me stop, take questions, comments. Mac, how?
Questions?
What you're in? Do you want to pick or should I?
I will, I'm sure I'll do it.
All right.
Sure.
So you spoke about with the Russian skeptics, the limits of certain policies, sanctions that don't get too close to home, and from a Japanese perspective and a European perspective, if the sanctions don't actually bring about talks in Ukraine, they're not really doing anything. So what's the final end game? Is it, sanction Russia and pressure Russia till there's a economic collapse in Russia, collapse of the Russian Federation, and like another reorganization like the fall of the Soviet Union, or is it just keep Russia, swatting it on the nose, but still consistently threatening the Baltics and Sweden and Finland?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A lot of it has to go with, I think, we have gotten into a pattern of where we sanction for sanction's sake. And the first question is to be, well, what do you want your sanctions to do? And if your sanctions were designed, and there's a great case to be made that the sanctions had deterrent effect. They didn't stop what had happened, but they may have prevented further action by saying, look, there are costs and consequences. So did it prevent a further Russian offensive to really, create the corridor between eastern Russia, the two separatist republics in Crimea, which was a concern in the end of 2015, that you were going to see this, what they called the Novorossiya project, where you were really going to try to separate southeastern Ukraine. So you could say the sanctions succeeded. If you're saying the sanctions were going to get Russia to leave Crimea, 3 years in, the sanctions don't appear to be doing that. They don't appear to have much prospect to be doing that. And the longer, it is a real testament to the ability of the European Union to hold these sanctions together every 6 months, because you now have so many interests in Europe that are saying, look, we've sanctioned long enough, there's money to be made, there's energy to be gotten. The question of how long will that continue. So the question is, if sanctions are designed to prevent further action, they've succeeded. If they're going to reverse, certainly they're not going to reverse Crimea. Are they going to get the Minsk process moving forward meaningfully? I don't know. Right now it's not looking like they will, and we are in a bit of a waiting game, because now the Russians have had a certain degree of confidence that they can outlast sanctions. They expect, for all the talk of hacking and everything else, people in Moscow expected Hillary Clinton to win. So they were assuming that sanctions were going to last for a while longer. So the economic team and the Putin brought back former finance minister Alexei Kudrin kind of as an economics guru. They were planning for how do we last for sanctions through to 2018. So they feel that they have some cushion. And then once they got the deal with OPEC, which has allowed oil prices to rise and to stabilize, that's also helped them in the short term. So right now the sanctions are looking a little less effective in terms of compelling Russia to a settlement on Ukraine. And certainly to get Russia out of Crimea, the sanctions that we have now, the gains that Russia gains geopolitically from having Crimea outweigh the sanctions. Russians are also getting creative on sanctions. And this is something that we also have to look at, is that the sanctions say, so a Western oil company can't transfer technology to a offshore project in Russia. So that meant, Exxon had to stop 9 out of the 10 projects that they were going to do in Russia. Schlumberger, others had to stop. Doesn't say, however, that you can't work on a project with a Russian entity in a third country. So now we're starting to see, well, we can't do a project with you in Russia, but we can do one with you in Mozambique or Brazil, and maybe we can set up a joint venture that will allow you to kind of master certain techniques that then that venture could bring back to Russia at some point in the future. Or the Japanese argument is that, hey, if we do something in the Kuriles, that's going to be a special zone. That's what Prime Minister Abe will be going to Moscow, and what he's hoping to get is a declaration on the islands as being a special zone that is not subject solely to Russian Federation law, and therefore kind of has a more, it's not, will then in Japanese eyes will not necessarily be clear that it's Russian territory. And therefore, if it's not clearly Russian territory anymore, do the sanctions apply to it? And then can you extend that? And then talk about perhaps some of the zones in the Arctic being jointly developed between Norway and Russia. Do they become... This may or may not work. What I'm saying is that there's a certain degree of new creativity that we're seeing as to people are trying to say, okay, we've had these sanctions for several years. Now, how do, if they're not necessarily going away, and this is again where skeptics and engagers, the skeptics I think have enough power to keep the letter of sanctions in place, but will they have the power to increase them or to enforce them, the spirit of the sanctions? Because people are looking for ways now on both Russia and then elsewhere, how can we get around the letter of sanctions? And we may see some of these creative things. Again, if you look at the Russian Arctic Forum that was held, I found that to be quite interesting because you're starting to see these hints about, yeah, sanctions are still here, but we can still develop these projects and keep them on schedule.
You were next, I think.
My question goes to the persistence of revival, 19th century geopolitical ideas among Russia's, the Kremlin's policy-making elite. Is it true that Alexander Dugin's ideas have become normative? And if they have become normative, how can the engagers here in the United States get around that unhappy fact?
Yeah, I mean, his ideas are part of the discussion, but he hasn't become the sole guru, shall we say, of Russian foreign policy. Russian foreign policy has its factions. There is still believe it or not, there is still a pro-American engagement faction in Russia that says Dugin's ideas are crazy, pie in the sky, not realistic, and really you should be thinking about engagement with the United States. There were hints of this in February. There was a debate inside of Russia when Michael Flynn was still National Security Advisor, because there was a thought that maybe Flynn was going to spearhead a request of Russia that maybe Russia should back away from Iran, or at least temper its relationship with Iran as part of improving relations with Russia. And you had a debate. You had those who said, we may not like Iran, we've fought wars with them in the past, but they've been reliable, we can't throw them under the proverbial bus. And then you had others who said, well, look, if this gets us a new qualitative relationship with the Trump administration, we're not going to completely abandon Iran, but we don't have to be as close with them. So I think you see the same thing with Dugin, that his ideas are there, they're influential, he has his patrons, he has people who say this is the way forward, but there are others who say, the United States is still the biggest game in town. It's still better to try to have a better relationship with Washington than to be adversarial to it. Same thing with the European Union. Questions about the relationship with China. So ironically, we often think of Russian politics, particularly in its domestic form, of not having a lot of debate in foreign policy. There is still a lot of ferment about where Russia belongs who are Russia's best allies and partners. And the American engagers aren't, they've taken some blows. They took hits after the failure of the reset. They kind of reemerged, particularly after Trump's election, and they're still there. You find them particularly in the foreign ministry. Some people that are saying, look, this is, the United States is really, we should make another effort to try to make this work with the U.S. and against Dugin's ideas. So he's a thinker, he's influential, but he's not the only faction.
I did before this about the media group from Radio Latvia. So you know in chess Gambit,
Yep.
chess Gambit is a risky enterprise.
Yep.
And it usually pays off, but a lot of smaller figures
Yep.
started with pawns being sacrificed, right? And then at the end of the game, grandmasters usually very often they agree to the draw. But meanwhile, in the process, smaller figures get captured or killed. So what's the risk for smaller countries, smaller figures,
Yep.
smaller countries like Latvia and Estonia, being sacrificed in this great grandmasters geopolitical games, also taking into consideration the 40% of Russian-speaking population in Latvia and Estonia?
Yeah, no, that goes back to the 19th century model, which was if you were a small power in Europe, the Congress system wasn't necessarily good to you. You might be told, hey, 2/5 of your land area is now going to be transferred to another country or an empire. So that there's a risk there. The question here will be in the U.S. is, I think that there's broad agreement, even among Russia engagers, that NATO commitments have to be upheld because you can't walk away from Article 5. Now, the debate is, do you extend Article 5 commitments further to countries that don't yet have them? That's where I think you'll see the debate, but I don't think you'll find anyone within these two camps in U.S. policy who are going to argue that Article 5 should be withdrawn or we go back and somehow the Senate unratifies the treaties that allowed for Baltic expansion, to NATO to expand to the Baltics, to other countries. To the extent that, and as we've seen, and I think part of the reaction in Europe and Eastern Europe has not just simply been because of the Russia threat, but also because of earlier statements of President Trump. To the extent to which allies are showing that they are in fact assuming burdens, that also changes the dynamic of, hey, we may be a pawn, but we're a useful, we're shouldering burdens and we're not free riding. And of course, you can go back 30 years, and that's one of Trump's consistent themes. He was saying that in the 1980s. Allies are free riders on the U.S., and the U.S. is being drained. So the extent to which you have robust allied relationships where allies are showing that in fact they are assuming burdens and correcting that impression, that will change things. In my own opinion, and Mac knows this because this is something we've been doing as part of FIPRI, my personal sense is I think the Russians, if they saw an opportunity in the Baltic states, they would move. I think they more or less accept that the Baltic line is fixed. Where they're moving is the Black Sea basin. That's where I think they see opportunity. They faint in the Baltic because they know that our attention is like iron fillings to a magnet. So they do something on the border of Estonia and everyone focuses on that. Meanwhile, as we've seen over the last couple of years, suddenly, the border fence with Georgia mysteriously moves. And, now it's closer to the Baku-Chehan line, and we're like, well, we can't be bothered with that because we've got to, we can only focus on one thing at a time. I think that my assessment is the Russians faint to the Baltics, but for them the real game is the Arctic and the Black Sea basin. And that's where they're trying to really break out and change the dynamic. Setback for them in Bulgaria, obviously, with the recent elections not quite going, I think, the way they wanted, but obviously their relationship with Turkey, and which has not, I think, gained as much attention as you think it might, as it should. They're definitely competing for influence in Turkey to try to woo the Turks. Their activities in the Caucasus. So the threat is there. You have to be worried about it. I don't want to say that people in Riga and Tallinn should sleep tight because really it's going to be the Black Sea, but I do think that that's where the Russians are going to put more of their geopolitical effort. That's where they want to change the post-Cold War settlement even more. Because I think that, and again, we can debate the missile strike of this past week, but it does suggest that the president is prepared to use force, and do you really want to make an Article 5 test? I don't know that the Russians are prepared at this point to decide that they want to bluff, see if the United States will bluff on an Article 5 commitment and do something in the Baltic states. But to do something with Georgia or to do something with Moldova where there's not an Article 5 guarantee and where the U.S. might be more inclined to say, bridge too far, we're not going to get involved, I think we're more likely to see something there in the coming years.
Yes, ma'am.
You said that we should know more, have more clarity tomorrow, but I'm not at all certain of that. You probably aren't either, but you have the administration, which seemed to going to be more accommodating to Russia, but now they're facing all of these investigations of just how cozy they were. And if that sounds like a superficial view, I have no problem having a superficial view of this administration.
No, I mean, look, domestic politics matter. When candidate Trump last year was talking about closer engagement, I want to seek ways to cooperate with Russia, that was taken at face value. Well, he's thinking differently. And then you started having more of these questions about campaign staff and others. Do they have undisclosed relationships with Russian entities or things like that? And that changes the dynamic, because it's one thing for you to say, I think we should have a fresh approach to Russia, because President Obama ran on the same thing in 2008. We need to have a fresh approach to Russia. He didn't quite have some of the campaign baggage on it. And that gave him freedom in 2009 to pursue the reset. You can't disentangle the strategic and the domestic political angle from this. So that has an impact. I think the Russians have begun to appreciate that, that President Trump does not have the freedom of action that they maybe hoped that he might have. Also, though, and I would, if you haven't gone back in recent years to reread your copy of Art of the Deal, Trump also is very clear that he tries things, and if they don't work, he moves on to something else. So he may have thought closer relations with Russia, this looks like something useful. Now it doesn't look like it's useful. He moves on. So there's that aspect as well. He may have decided that Russia, being closer to Russia, has too many liabilities at this point without having the benefits he might have expected. The Pentagon review, when he asked, well, what would cooperation with Russia and Syria look like, didn't come back as a ringing endorsement. He may have looked at that and said, I don't agree with it, or he may have looked at it and said, okay, this changes my thinking, so now I'm going to move on to something else. So no, it's not superficial, because it's part of the domestic political dialogue, and it means that it has an influence on policy. Secretary Tillerson, you go back to his hearings, I think has had to go out of his way to demonstrate that despite being CEO of Exxon, despite having these business relationships, that he has to show precisely that he is not going to be too sympathetic to Russia or not accepting the Russian line on things, that a different choice as Secretary of State, if it had been Richard Haas or who were some of the other people on the short list that released, they wouldn't have had the same, we had to make the same accommodations. He does, because he has a background with Russia, and you can't get away from that domestic angle. This is the classic, right? You teach Putnam's two-level games, right, in the Institute. You negotiate with someone else, but you negotiate with your own political system, and because of some of the personnel choices that the president has made, he now has to take the domestic perception of does his team have a relationship with Russia that means they are not thinking of American national interests, but they're thinking of, personal interests, and did Russia assist those personal interests? The investigation may end up clearing it and saying there's nothing there, but that's a reality that now impacts the U.S.-Russia relationship.
Simply the back.
Richard Jacobson from Norway. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on the Russian interest in the Arctic, since you mentioned
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they certainly, I think, want to make the case that Russia matters as the guarantor of the Northern Sea Passage, that Russia, that therefore you, Europeans, Asians, all have a vested interest in this goes back to the earlier question about, do we want Russia to collapse? Well, Russia's saying not if you want a stable Arctic. And you might want Russia to keep the northern sea routes open and, have a network of stations there. They definitely, I think, see, not in the short term, because they now say oil prices have to go up, but that's the long-term energy future of Russia. That's where Russia's future energy endowment lies. To the extent that there are changes in climate and more of northern Russia becomes ice-free, if you may have a population shift, more resources become accessible. And again, moving away from areas right now which Russia may feel, particularly on its western border, are exposed. If you kind of withdraw to the Siberian north, if it's more accessible, you put more things there. They definitely would like to keep NATO out of the Arctic. It's been part of their strategy to try to divide the different Arctic countries. So certainly the Rosneft-Statoil relationship, hey, we can both make money together and let's keep it within us, right? We don't need outsiders to really mess up a profitable relationship. The outreach to the Canadians of your view on Arctic sovereignty and ours are similar, so why don't we share things together? And kind of what they don't want in the Arctic Council is it to be like it is sometimes for them on the UN Security Council, where they're the lone, everyone is ranged against them, and it's always the other members of the Arctic Council and then Russia. They would, I think, like to have Norway sometimes be with them, Canada sometimes be with them, and then to minimize the U.S. role. Certainly, they would definitely, as part of their strategies, they don't want the United States to be as active in the Arctic. And if we get distracted again in the Middle East, that's great, because the more we do there means the less we do up there. So.
Sure. John Fabry, a student studying Russian. I'm interested in your view on sustainability of Russian foreign policy. We're talking about them doing things in the Arctic. They have to match things going on in the Baltic. They're involved in Ukraine. You're talking about them being a Middle Eastern power, having actions in the Pacific, even maybe in Libya. Do you find that sustainable, and do you think they can continue that long term, especially considering the economy and the limited amount of people that have to drop forces?
A couple things on that. And again, this speaks to a creativity that the Russians may or may not show moving forward. They've shown signs of it already. The first is they can continue to do all these as long as these things remain limited. Right? You can't have major blow-ups. You have a contract, increasingly a contract professional military that is being re-equipped that can handle the current tempo. It assumes one of several things. One is that there's no major succession blow-up in Central Asia. They dodged a bullet in Uzbekistan. Karimov died. You didn't have the country fall apart. You've had succession that has taken place that's been relatively stable, didn't require them to get involved. If that had happened, then you start choosing. Well, maybe Ukraine isn't as important, or you tell Assad, sorry, we're going to be pulling people out. So you need to make sure that there are no major blow-ups. Ukraine is manageable under current circumstances. 5 years from now, we saw that this pattern occur in the former Yugoslavia with Croatia. If 5 to 10 years from now you complete the reorganization and retraining of a Ukrainian military, does that change? Does that therefore mean the Russians can't sustain kind of their quiet support for separatist movements and the like? But that depends a lot on Ukraine. Does Ukraine continue with reforms? Can it sustain itself? Is there a third Maidan in Ukraine where people get tired of promises not being fulfilled, and then if you have continued political turmoil in Ukraine over the next 5 years, then Russia can sustain in Ukraine. Population is interesting because, of course, Russia increased its population since 2014 with 2 million new Crimeans in the Russian Federation, plus another 1 million Ukrainian migrants coming into Russia from, and most of those migrants aren't going to go back to Donbass, or they're going to stay in Russia. So you now have 3 million people have been added effectively to the population of Russia. Russians are experimenting more with, we look at, and again, this is a problem of comparison. We look at Russia and we say, well, it's trillion GDP. It's 10% the size of the American economy. Against the European and U.S. economies, it's very small. But compared to its neighborhood, Russia is a very good economy. And it's doing much better than everyone else. So it continues. It's the third largest recipient of migrants in the world after the United States and Europe. Russia is pulling people from other parts of the Soviet Union, and then from other parts of the world as well, but particularly from the former Soviet Union. It's one reason why Ukraine has gone from 54 million people in 1989 to 44 million people today. Russia is a magnet pulling people in. It's pulling in people from Uzbekistan, Central Asia. What they're doing with the military is interesting, is of course that's a path to citizenship. And there's a report, I think, that just came out about Russian recruitment of non-Russian citizens into Russian military formations for use in Ukraine and elsewhere. So that if you are in Uzbekistan and you maybe don't want to go and be a construction laborer in Moscow, but you look at your life in Uzbekistan and say, I don't really see a lot of opportunity here, and someone comes and says, hey, become, like Foreign Legion, sign up with the Russian military. What they did with the Abkhaz, what they did with South Ossetia, what they've done with Armenians. Hey, come join and be part of the Russian military. There's a way for them to get around the population issue. That you don't. And also, of course, Russian military strategy is changing because they're no longer relying on the large mass conscript formations of the Cold War. They are belatedly following the Abrams path that was blazed here with the volunteer force of a smaller but professional force. They still have conscription, so it's not completely gone, but they are moving to mobile brigades as opposed to conscript divisions as the way that they're going to project power, which means you don't need as large of a military establishment, which is why they're letting more Russians that are shirking draft duty. It's become, you're not seeing what you saw, particularly in the late Soviet period, where you're trying to press gang people into the military. There's lots of Russians now, young Russian men, that aren't showing up for military service, that aren't sitting worried about the knock at the door on their university dorms saying, you haven't reported for basic training yet. So to that extent, if, no blow up in Central Asia, no major change in the Ukrainian military balance, continued interventions elsewhere where the bulk of what Russia does is provide advanced capability. So again, with Syria, the bulk of the force in Syria is the Quds force in Hezbollah, is not Russians backing the Syrian army. So if, as long as Iran is willing to provide large numbers of ground forces, then you can have a smaller Russian air contingent that has great effect. You keep all that, then they can sustain this certainly through 2024 or 2030. We think 2050 we can maybe project out, but for policymakers you got to deal with the Russia you expect of the next 8 years, not the Russia you might hope might emerge by 2050. So yeah, I think it's sustainable, and the economy is recovering. 2% growth projected for this year. Russian state bonds, Moody's says, thumbs up, positive, go ahead and buy. You talk to our hedge fund friends in New York, they're eager to get back into a Russian stock market that outperformed the U.S. one last year. So the economy's not doing great, but it's doing all right, and they can muddle through, I think, for the near future.
So last question. Yeah.
There's still a lot of people in this town who think there's a scenario by which Crimea would be returned to Ukraine, which I view as a tremendous delusion, because it would mean a century of roadside bombs and GRU-assisted terrorism. So I'm intrigued at the prospect of trading away something you've already lost. That is to say, okay, you've won, congratulations, you can declare victory in Crimea, but you're going to have to get your boys out of Ukraine and Transnistria. If you do that, we'll undo the 1954 gift to the Ukraine and acknowledge your victory, and everybody wins, and we're all happy. Is there any prospect of that kind of deal?
Interesting, because you had people talking about that. I mean, I think the first reaction in Moscow is, we already have what we want. What are you offering us? What are you going to give us beyond? So you're going to rhetorically accept? Because look, the Russians have taken as their model North Cyprus, right? Turks have been in North Cyprus since I was yay tall. and had hair. And what price, so if we turned around and said, well, since 1970, we're going to recognize North Cyprus now. If you do something else for us, Turks are going to say, well, why? We already have what we want. I think there's some thinking of that right now in the Russian mindset, that we already have it. But the Russians are now beginning to deal with the prospect that these sanctions may last, or that if the big Russian suspicion is that if they comply with a list, their thing is that suddenly we're going to come up with another 10 items for reasons why sanctions have to stay. Because they've already gone through this rodeo with Jackson Vanik. That once they allowed for immigration, then it was, well, you're not allowing chicken imports from Delaware. Or, missionaries from the United States were arrested in Omsk, and so we're going to keep sanctions on you until the next 10 items on the list are revealed. So they're going to say, really, you're going to lift the sanctions first, and then maybe we'll do this, and which we're not going to do. So we kind of have that standoff. Unless the Russian economy, goes back to the earlier question, unless the Russian economy really begins to tank in such a way that the Russians might then be more willing to accept the deal. The wild card in this ultimately is also, where does Ukraine fit in this? Because on the one hand, Ukraine has its territorial integrity violated. On the other hand, it hasn't escaped notice that eliminating 2 million pro-Russian voters in Crimea has been very beneficial to Ukrainian politics, because it has ended the continual shift back and forth for the last 20 years of Ukrainian politics. You now have a solid pro-Western majority in Ukrainian politics. That having Crimea meant you also had to accept 2 million plus voters who would cast a vote for whoever the most pro-Kremlin candidate was. Donbass the same way. So you've had people saying, well, maybe there's a deal where Ukraine sells Crimea. Maybe that's not feasible right now. That could happen down the road. Perhaps that might be something. Or shared sovereignty, island solution, where the titular sovereignty of the state is recognized, but in fact it's understood that another state actually administers it. Why the Kurile, some of the mechanisms for resolving the Kurile Islands disputes are interesting, because could that then provide a method for, hey, no one has to give up any claims, but you find a way to get around the sovereignty issue. Problem is, I don't think you have governments either in Moscow or in Kiev that are prepared to move in those directions. But certainly on that, the idea of, well, we'll recognize Crimea. My read of the Russians right now is they're not interested in our recognition of Crimea for what we would ask of them in return. So they say, well, why would we want to do that? And give up Transnistria, give up the position we have in other parts of the Black Sea, because ultimately when you look at the map of the Black Sea and you look at the changes over the last 8 years, Abkhazia, Crimea, Donbass, Transnistria, what used to look like a very small Russian corner, northeastern corner of the Black Sea, is now starting to look a lot like, Mare Nostrum for the Russians. And with their new relationship with the Turks, it starts to look even better. So theoretically possible. I don't see that the political stars are aligning at this point. But that's just my opinion. So.
I forgot to mention that I really do like your hairstyles. Can you join me in thanking Nick?
Thank you, Mark.